Yes, this pullover is as soft as it looks, and it's surprisingly not too difficult to knit. It's fitted to cut down on any unwanted bulkiness, and it's a slightly shorter length, making it great for layering or pairing with mid to high-waisted leggings or jeans. The step-by-step tutorial is coming up. This pullover has 9 simple components: 2 body panels, front and back, 2 sleeves, 2 body panel bands made of our secondary yarn, 2 sleeve bands, and a collar. We'll start off with the front and back panels since they're the most basic. With the faux fur yarn and the larger of the 2 required needles, get yourself a nice long tail to work the long tail cast on. So to do that, simply drape the yarn over your needle and then gather it up in your fingers. Now swing the needle down to catch the loop on your thumb, then swing it up and catch the loop on your index finger. Then release the thumb loop over the tip of the needle. Now you have 2 loops on your needle, or 2 stitches. Since this pattern's available in multiple different sizes, you'll need to refer to the pattern to get the specific number of stitches you need to cast on for the size you want to make. Now when you have the proper number of stitches cast on your needle for the size you're working on, it'll look something like this. From there, you'll flip it over to start working the first row. Now the good news about this pattern is that it's really basic in terms of stitch pattern, and it pretty much has to be because we're working with really fuzzy yarn, right? But the good thing about fur yarn, in this one specifically, is that when you flip it over, the underside really helps you to see the loops on your needle and really helps you to sort of navigate through the stitches. So find the first stitch or that first loop on your needle and knit it. Then knit every other stitch in this row. So all of the body panels are worked in garter stitch, which means you'll just knit every single stitch of every single row. With the exception of the sleeves, there's an increase in there that we'll talk about in just a bit, but it is worked in garter stitch as well. So when you get to the end of the row, you'll flip it over and knit every stitch once again. So that's the repeat. Continue knitting every stitch of every row until your body panel measures a certain length. Now that length, of course, is determined by the size you're making, so refer to the pattern to get that number. Now eventually, you'll have to join a new skein of yarn. When that happens, leave yourself a long enough tail from the old skein so you can weave that in later, and then grab the end from the new skein and loop it over, again leaving a long enough tail to weave in. Then you'll simply insert your needle through the stitch as if you were going to knit it as normal, but instead of yarning over with the old yarn, you'll place the loop from the new skein on it and then pull that through the stitch. That'll complete the stitch with the new skein, and all you have to do is continue knitting with that new skein. After you work a stitch or two, you'll want to take a second to tie those 2 ends off to make sure it's nice and secure, but that's all there is to it. When your panel measures the length you need for your size, you're ready to bind off. To do that, you'll knit the first 2 stitches, then pass the first loop over the last loop. Then knit the next stitch, and pass the first loop over the last. That's all there is to it. Keep going until there's only one loop left on your needle. Then pull up on that loop, trim a nice long tail. We want it to be long enough that we can sew some of these panels together. Now repeat the previous steps to make a second body panel, so you have, of course, a front and a back to your pullover. All right, moving on to the arm panels. Again, we'll use the long tail cast on, so get yourself a nice long tail, not nearly as long as before because this panel is much smaller, and cast on the total number of stitches required for your size using the same technique as before. Then flip it and knit the first row. So the arm panels are worked in garter stitch like the front and the back panel, so nothing new here. We're just knitting every stitch of every row, but we're adding in a few increase rows so it has a better shape and fit to it. To get this sort of triangular shape, increase rows are evenly spaced throughout the length of the sleeve, and the placement of those increases is different for each size. You'll definitely need to refer to the pattern here in order to figure out how many knit rows you have to work and how many increase rows and where to work those. So keep in mind when you look at that pattern, your non-increasing rows will say K all stitches or knit all stitches. That's just your normal garter stitch row. The increase row will look a little bit different. So when you get to an increase row, this is what you'll do. The first stitch is KFB, which stands for knit front back. That's your increase stitch. To work a KFB, insert your needle, wrap it, and pull it through, kind of like you're completing a knit stitch, but don't slide it off your needle just yet. Instead, swing it around and then stick it under the back loop. Then wrap the needle and knit it off. So that increases your stitch count by 1 for that one increased stitch. Then you'll continue knitting the rest of the stitches until you get to the last one. For the last stitch, you'll KFB again, just like you saw before, and that'll add an additional stitch to your row. So this increasing row increases your stitch count by 2 because you have a KFB at the beginning and a KFB at the end. So those 2 rows collectively make up the pattern for the sleeves. You're going to knit some rows, just solid knitting, and you're going to sprinkle in an increase row every now and then, just like you saw. So what you'll need to do again is refer to the pattern to get that specific distribution of knit rows and increase rows based on the size that you're working. And remember, each size is a little different, so the pattern has all 9 sizes spelled out. As always, you can view the full pattern online at my website, but if you want a printable copy of the pattern, that option is available for B.Hooked Insiders. As an insider, you'll be able to download and print this pattern as well as dozens more. You can have access to our messaging system so you can get pattern support directly from me if you need it. You'll be able to vote for upcoming patterns and tutorials, and now our latest feature, which is being added basically as we speak, ad-free tutorials. That'll be included in the B.Hooked Insider membership along with all those other perks. So if this sounds like something that'll help you, check out the link in the description to see all the details and how to sign up. All right, when you follow through with the sleeve pattern and you've worked it to the full length, it'll look something like this. Now for the bind off. Fortunately, the bind off is worked exactly the same as the body panels, so you'll just repeat everything you did for those two panels. Then of course, don't forget to make one more sleeve following all the same instructions. Next up, we have the bands, and although they're different lengths and widths, the pattern is the same, which makes it really simple to make. Since they're worked in the same way, I'm going to demonstrate with a sleeve band, but just know that you'll follow these same instructions for all 5 bands that you need to make. You'll use the long tail cast on again, so get yourself a long tail and cast on the number of stitches indicated in the pattern for the size and the band you're making. When you have the right number of stitches cast on, flip it and knit the first stitch. Now for the next stitch, you'll make a purl. Followed by a knit, and a purl. And that's the repeat for the band. Knit 1, purl 1. This is going to make a nice stretchy ribbing. So when you get to the end of your row, turn it and continue with the same pattern. You're always going to knit the knits and purl the purls for this pattern. But if you're new to knitting, that can be a little tough to follow until you can really recognize what a knit and a purl stitch looks like when it's on the needles. So whenever you see a horizontal bar sitting just below the needle or the cord, that's a purl stitch. And a stitch that looks like it has a little V, well, that's a knit stitch. Okay, so go ahead and knit the first stitch and purl the next. Then continue with your knit 1, purl 1 repeat to the end of the row, making sure you're knitting the knits and purling the purls. You'll continue with this repeat until the band measures a certain length. Again, refer to the pattern to get that information for the size and the particular band you're working on. The body panel and the sleeve bands are the same height, but they're different widths. And of course, the collar is a different length and a different width altogether, so you want to refer to the pattern to get that information. But just know you'll follow this same cast on, knit 1, purl 1 repeat for all of the bands. When you're ready to bind off, this is what you'll do. Start by knitting the first stitch and purling the second. Then pass that first loop over the last loop. Then look at your next stitch. The next one is a knit, so you'll knit that stitch. Then pass the first loop over the last. Now the next stitch is a purl, so purl it. Then pass the first loop over the last. Keep going in this way, working one stitch and binding it off, and just be sure you're always knitting the knits and purling the purls so the pattern stays consistent. Like you saw with the body panels and the sleeves, when you have just one loop left, pull up on the loop, trim a nice long tail, make it long enough that you can use it to seam it to the panels, and then pull the tail through the loop to fasten it off. Now once again, using your pattern as reference, finish knitting the bands. Remember, you'll need 2 sleeve bands, 2 body panel bands, and a neck band. When you have all 9 components finished, start the assembly by sewing the bands to each of their corresponding panels. You'll want to secure it to the corner first. Then place the needle under the neck stitch, I'm catching both loops, and catch the body panel to whip stitch it in place, and to keep going. Now you'll quickly begin to realize that the stitches are really noticeable at first, but all you need to do is take your needle and pull the fur out from under the stitches and it'll completely hide them. Using this same technique, make sure you have all 4 bands sewn to their corresponding body panels. Seaming the pullover comes next. Lay the 2 body panels with the right sides facing each other, facing inward, and the band situated at the bottom. First, you'll seam along the side edges. Then when you reach a certain point, you'll bring in the arm. Don't worry, I'll show you the seaming in just a minute, but first I wanted you to get a good idea of how it all comes together first and how you're going to lay it out as you seam it. So fold the arm in half, again with the right side facing inward, and align it with the top edge of the pullover. Start by seaming along the edge of the first 2 bands. Then switch over to the fur yarn, seaming the 2 panels together up to the point where your sleeve is. Once again, I'm whip stitching through all of this, but honestly, you can use any seaming method you like. At the sleeve, you'll transition from seaming the 2 body panels together to seaming a body panel and part of the sleeve together. And keep seaming until you reach the top of the body panel and then flip it over. Then you'll just seam the opposite panel with the sleeve on this side of the pullover. Next, start seaming along the bottom edge of the sleeve. And of course, when you reach the band, you'll switch to the band yarn and seam the two ends together. Now just repeat all of those steps for the other side. All right, next up, fold the two ends of the collar band inward so it looks like this. Then you'll want to find the center point of your body panels by measuring between the sleeves and marking that with a stitch marker. Now we'll sort of eyeball it here at first and we'll do a little bit more fine-tuning later. Align the collar, that opening of the collar, with the stitch marker and use that as sort of a guide so you can see how far you need to seam in the shoulders. You'll want to do that on both sides. Next, secure one end of the collar at the marker and start stitching the collar in place. It's helpful to secure the other side of the collar too. It'll make seaming it in place much easier, and it'll let you know if you need to continue seaming up the shoulders a little more to reach the edges of the collar. Once you have the collar in place, go ahead and seam the two ends of the collar together. And we just have a few more finishing touches to go. First up, weave in the ends of the bands. And for the fur yarn, you can either tie them off and trim it short, or you can weave them in as well. With this yarn, it's a little bit harder to get them to stay in place because you can't split the yarn like you normally would when you're weaving in ends. So just keep that in mind. If you're weaving this in, you might see the ends poke out. Next, turn it right side out, and the last thing you'll want to do is fluff out the seams with your needle. This is a really cool trick that I love doing because it basically makes the seams disappear. I know this was a long one, so thank you so much for tuning in and following along. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so if you're into this sort of thing. I share knitting and crochet videos for all sorts of projects, and I definitely want to see you back for the next one. Those little actions, subscribing, liking, and commenting, they help me in tremendous ways so I can continue sharing this craft that we both love. Also, I want to say a big thanks to my B.Hooked insiders. Their support is incredible, and there's honestly no way I could keep doing what I'm doing without them. Our latest insider is Deanna. Welcome, Deanna. I'm so happy to have you in the community, and I appreciate your support so much. Now, if you would like to become an insider, I'll have a link in the description below for you to check that out and sign up. Happy knitting, and I'll see you in the next one.